On September 17th, 1978, a Fairchild FH227D crashed in the Himalayas. Alex Reyes, aged 20, and 27 others managed to survive the crash, stranded in the mountains of Himalaya. But what happened in those mountains turned to the worst nightmare no one could ever imagine. Even now, 40 years later, the memories are still so vivid in my mind. My name is Alex, and I was one of the survivors of Flight 2317, which crashed in the Himalayas in 1978. This is the story of how me and 15 others out of a total of 27 other people managed to survive against all odds. It started as a routine flight. We were a college soccer team heading to a match in Nepal. There were 42 of us on board, including players, coaches, and some family members. The mood was light as we took off from Delhi. We joked, played cards, and talked about the upcoming game. None of us knew the horror that awaited us. I remember the first jolt of turbulence. It wasn't unusual, so we didn't think much of it. But then came another, stronger this time. The plane started to shake violently. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Panic set in as we realized something was seriously wrong. The next few moments were chaos. The plane lurched and dove, people screamed. I gripped my seat, knuckles white, heart pounding. There was a deafening roar, then darkness. I woke to bitter cold and blinding white. My head throbbed and I tasted blood. Slowly, painfully, I became aware of my surroundings. The plane had split in two. Bodies and debris were scattered across the snow. The silence was eerie, broken only by moans of pain and the howling wind. As the shock wore off, those of us who could move began to check on others. Out of the 42 passengers and crew, only 27 of us had survived the initial crash. Many were injured, some critically. We had no idea where we were, only that we were high in the mountains, surrounded by peaks and glaciers. The first day went towards tending to the wounded and trying to salvage what we could from the wreckage. We found some food and blankets, but it wasn't nearly enough. The temperature dropped rapidly as night fell. We huddled together in the remains of the fuselage, trying to keep warm. Days passed, and hope of quick rescue faded. We had no way to communicate with the outside world. The plane's radio was destroyed in the crash. We tried to remain optimistic, telling ourselves that search parties must be out there looking for us. But as each day ended with no sign of rescue, doubt crept in. Our situation grew dire. Food was running low, and the extreme cold was taking its toll. 2 more of our group died from their injuries. We buried them in the snow, a somber reminder of our fragile hold on survival. A week after the crash, we faced a brutal truth. We were going to run out of food. The realization hit us like a physical blow. We had rationed carefully, but there simply wasn't enough. As hunger gnawed at us, we began to discuss the unthinkable. It was Marco, our team captain, who first suggested it. "If we are going to survive, I'm afraid we have to eat our dead," he said. The silence that followed was deafening. We all knew he was right, but no one wanted to admit it. The decision wasn't made lightly. We debated, we argued, we cried. In the end, the instinct to survive won. With heavy hearts and churning stomachs, we began to cut flesh from the frozen bodies of our friends and teammates. The first meal was the hardest thing I've ever done. The taste was indescribable, a mix of revulsion and desperate need. Some couldn't keep it down. Others wept as they ate, but we did it because we had to. It was eat or die. As weeks turned into a month, our situation grew more desperate. The cold was relentless, seeping into our bones. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. We lost 2 more to the cold, their bodies too weak to fight anymore. We tried to keep our spirits up. We told stories, sang songs, anything to distract us from this nightmare. But the weight of our circumstances was crushing. Each day was a battle against the elements and our own despair. It was during one of these low moments that Javier, our goalkeeper, proposed a daring plan. "We need to send a team to find help," he said. "If we stay here, we'll all die, eventually." The idea was met with mixed reactions. Some thought it was suicide to venture out into the mountains. Others saw it as our only hope. After much debate, we agreed. A team of 3 would set out to find civilization. Javier volunteered immediately. So did Lisa, a tough defender known for her endurance. I surprised myself by raising my hand as well. Maybe it was a death wish, or maybe I just couldn't stand waiting anymore. Whatever the reason, I was in. We spent days preparing for the journey. We fashioned crude snowshoes from plane parts and seat cushions. We gathered what little food we had left and dressed in layers of clothing scavenged from luggage and the dead. The morning of our departure was solemn. We knew the odds were against us, but we had to try. As we said our goodbyes, I looked at the faces of my teammates and friends. Some were hopeful, others resigned. All were gaunt and haunted by what we'd been through. Our journey was grueling from the start. The terrain was treacherous, all jagged rocks and deep snow. We battled exhaustion, altitude sickness, and the constant, biting cold. Each step was a struggle, but we pushed on, knowing that lives depended on us. We climbed impossibly steep slopes, crossed icy rivers, and navigated through blinding snowstorms. Our food ran out quickly, forcing us to subsist on small amounts of dried flesh we'd brought from the crash site. The thought of what we were eating made me sick, but hunger overrode disgust. On the 5th day, disaster struck. We were crossing a narrow ledge when Lisa lost her footing. She slipped and fell, tumbling down the mountainside. Javier and I watched in horror, helpless to save her. There was just no way we could get to her. We were devastated. We considered turning back, but we knew that wasn't an option. We symbolically buried Lisa as best we could and carried on, more determined than ever to find help. The next few days were the hardest of my life. We were weakening rapidly, our bodies pushed far beyond their limits. Javier developed a hacking cough that worried me. I was battling severe frostbite in my toes. But we kept moving, one agonizing step at a time. We had no other choice. It was either continue onwards or certain death. On the 9th day, we spotted something that made our hearts leap. A dirt road in the distance. It was the first sign of human presence we'd seen since the crash. With renewed energy, we pushed towards it. We reached the road as night was falling. Exhausted beyond belief, we collapsed by the roadside, hoping someone would find us. Hours passed. I drifted in and out of consciousness. Was that the sound of an engine or just the wind? I awoke to voices and lights. At first I thought I was dreaming, but as my eyes focused, I saw people, actual people, bending over us. They were speaking a language I didn't understand, but their concern was clear. We were loaded into vehicles and taken to a small village. There, we managed to communicate our story through a mix of broken English and gestures. The villagers were shocked but immediately sprang into action, contacting authorities and caring for us as best they could. Within a day, helicopters arrived. Javier and I were airlifted to a hospital in Kathmandu. As we flew over the mountains, I thought of our friends still waiting at the crash site. Would we be in time to save them? The rescue operation was massive. Multiple countries sent teams to search for the wreckage. It took 3 agonizing days before they finally located the crash site. Of the 22 people we'd left behind, only 14 had survived. The others had succumbed to cold, injuries, or despair. The world was shocked by our story. Media from around the globe descended on the hospital where we were recovering. They wanted all the gory details, how we'd survived, what we'd eaten. Some called us heroes. Others were horrified by what we'd done to stay alive. For us, the survivors, the return to normal life was far from easy. We were all deeply traumatized by what we'd been through. The taste of human flesh, the constant fight against death, the losses we'd suffered. These things don't just go away. I struggled with nightmares and panic attacks. Everyday activities like eating or being in enclosed spaces could trigger intense anxiety. I know the others faced similar challenges. We went through extensive therapy, both individually and as a group. One of the hardest parts was facing the families of those who didn't make it. How do you look a parent in the eye and tell them that you survived by eating their child? It was gut-wrenching, but we felt we owed them the truth. To my surprise, many of them understood. They said they were glad their loved ones' deaths had meant life for others. As months turned into years, we slowly began to heal. The survivors formed a tight-knit group. We met regularly, supporting each other through the ups and downs of recovery. Some of us wrote books or gave talks about our experience. Others preferred to stay out of the public eye. For me, the healing process involved a lot of soul-searching. I grappled with guilt, questioning why I had survived when others hadn't. I battled depression and considered suicide more than once. But ultimately, I chose to live. Not just survive, but really live. I threw myself into charity work, particularly organizations that support rescue operations and trauma survivors. It felt like a way to honor those we'd lost and to make something positive out of our ordeal. Looking back now, 40 years after the crash, I'm still amazed by the resilience of the human spirit. What we went through was horrific, beyond what most people can imagine. But we survived. We adapted. We did what we had to do. I've learned that survival isn't always pretty. Sometimes it requires us to do things we never thought we were capable of. But I've also learned that humans are incredibly strong. We can endure far more than we think possible. Today I lead a relatively normal life. I'm married with 2 kids. I have a job I enjoy. But I'll never forget those 72 days in the mountains. They changed me fundamentally, reshaping my understanding of life, death, and what it means to be human. I still have nightmares sometimes. I still flinch at the sound of planes overhead, and there are days when the memories overwhelm me. But I've made peace with what happened. I've accepted that it's part of who I am. A survivor